Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park. And today we bring you our first read of Aloha Vietnam by Dr. Elizabeth Nguyen. We are in this world that is created by Dr. Nguyen. It's a world that involves a character of a mother who is Xuan and her daughter who is An, and we are placed in the setting of Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
I think with the recent tragedies of Lahaina, I think with the many, many years of poor occupation and destruction from not just American troops, but American tourism, I think there's a lot of purpose to describe the setting of Hawaii and kind of try to back up and maybe see Hawaii from a different lens than somewhere that should be traveled or used as a place as a getaway.
For sure. Hawaii, very similar to Guam, is overrun by US troops, like you said. And in addition, the way that Hawaii was acquired or annexed into the United States was by being stolen.
Right. So in chapter 12, Dr. Nguyen does briefly describe kind of the setting of how Hawaii was positioned in the way that it is. And in a perspective of Xuan, we get to see a different perspective of Hawaii rather than the one that we tend to get on movies and from people doing trips.
Mm-hmm.
So, a quote directly from the book from chapter 12 is I was shocked to learn of Hawaii's history with the U.S. when I read about Queen Liliuokalani, the last reigning monarch of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and how she was overthrown in a coup d'etat in 1893, which eventually led to Hawaii becoming annexed and an official territory of the United States. My blood started to boil again. It had only been a century or so that this land belonged to another country, another government, another people.
Yeah, and like you said, oftentimes what people see of Hawaii is usually what's focused on in books and in movies, and those things are usually the beauty and looking at what the locals have, but instead, there's more history and depth to it.
Right, and not only history, but the direction that Hawaii is going is it's being overrun, it's being overpopulated, and it's becoming extremely expensive for the locals, the people that have lived there for generations, for them to survive, not even to live like an island life, I guess, which is what a lot of Americans are seeking. So we are destroying the economy and the livelihood of many people.
Mm-hmm.
It's starting to become displayed a lot more. We're starting to find out more information about what this looks like. And like I said earlier in the episode, tragedies like the Lahaina fires really start to project how big of an issue this really is. There are people that are trying to go back to their lands that were destroyed, and yet there are developers coming in trying to take that land for their own profit.
Mm.
There is a point of contention, which is what John brings up, which is another quote that I kind of want to mention. And what she says is comfort, conversely, had American protection and economic development helped to improve life in Hawaii and make it possible for people like my family to find refuge and start a new life here. So she's referencing the fact that it did take the American occupation for certain countries to feel like they were comfortable traveling and moving to Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
So there are benefits for how Hawaii ended up being opened up to society and to a larger population.
Mm.
But I do think that the overall direction of where that then went, of how they started overtaking the island, rather than looking at it as a source of benefit and feeding back into the island, is very different.
Totally. It's all about listening to the native people and actually taking action in the way that they lead.
Right. And another thing that we should do is kind of keep money in that area. Like we should stop allowing for large chain hotels that have nothing to do with Hawaii or the people that live there and start putting that money back into the people that actually have a home there and have chosen to be on that island for many generations. So when people stay there, the money should stop filtering around back into the mainland, but it should actually filter around through Hawaii and support the people there.
Right. It's in the same way for short-term rentals. Rather than renting from a white family who has a vacation home in Hawaii, rent from a native Hawaiian family that's been there for generations.
Yeah, and usually on our podcast, what we're going to do, and almost all the time, as much as we can, we're going to spotlight Asian people and Asian American people and people that do a good job of explaining this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I know there are a lot of amazing people out there that do explain the trauma and what goes on with Hawaii,
Yes.
but a lot of them don't have the budget and production as some other studios do.
Mm-hmm.
So, one thing I would recommend for people is on HBO, there's a person that we watch. His name is John Oliver. If you haven't seen him, he's very funny, but he's also very intelligent in the way that their team produces material and they gather information. And he recently did a segment on Hawaii and the destruction of that land. Once again, we want to highlight the people that are actually out there doing the work within the Hawaiian population and the native people. But John Oliver just has a lot of money, and he did a great job of trying to highlight the inconsistencies and incongruencies with American travel and what Americans are doing to Hawaii and what has been done to that land. So I highly recommend that you do go check that out.
And for those of you who want to listen to people on the ground, Kara Pelagia Tapai Jabola Corolis, someone that we highlighted in our recommendations before, is a great person to listen to as well.
Yeah, and their Instagram handle is Decolonize Feminism.
Yes.
So before we get into the rest of the read about this family that lives in Hawaii, let's actually go into our actual recommendation for this week.
Our recommendation for the week is Felix of Soft Velvet Boy. Felix is a designer and illustrator based in Seattle. He prioritizes working with marginalized identities and community-based initiatives. What I like about Felix's work is that it's very whimsical and anime-esque. You can learn more about Felix's work through his website at softvelvetboy.com and find him on Instagram at softvelvetboy.
Yep, and that's going to be our recommendation for the week. Okay, so we're on our first read of Aloha Vietnam by Dr. Elizabeth Nguyen. We are doing our first read, which are pages 11 through 80. So that's going to start with an intro poem, Tidelands, as well as the prologue in chapter 1, Xuan, 1992, through chapter 14, Xuan, 1992, which, as you read it, it makes sense for where we are.
Definitely. And just as a brief content warning, there is a moment of manic episode, and that's just for those of us who need that space to know that that's coming up.
Yep. And before we get into the major read, we've talked about this before that you and I may not have the most perfect pronunciation of different languages,
Mm-hmm.
and Vietnamese is definitely one of the ones I know I struggle with the most. So if I am pronouncing this horribly, I highly apologize. I just truly am not good at especially tonal languages.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the reason I'm going to struggle, and I will try to get better as I listen to more things.
Absolutely. It's all about trying, but also it's also understanding that we're not from these cultures and we're trying to respect it as much as we can.
Right. So let's get into the story because the story revolves around one family
Mm-hmm.
specifically.
Mm-hmm. And like we mentioned earlier up top, it is focused on two different points of view from the mother Schwan and the daughter An.
Right. And Xuan is married to Long, and they both moved to Honolulu, Hawaii in 1975. They are escaping the communist regime that is expected to come into Vietnam at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And they make this massive decision to leave the life that they have back at home, which involves their parents. It involves all of their structural systems, including
Right.
their stability with jobs. They had a person who cooked for them, who apparently cooked amazingly.
Yes.
And they're leaving all of that so that they can create a better life for their children.
Right. And part of that better life is going from menial wages and then starting their own business venture, selling tchotchkes at a shop.
Right. And this is something that Joan does as a way to try to level up her family's life.
Mm-hmm.
She sees that if they only work these jobs at like a nail salon or doing these menial tasks, they won't ever grow into becoming a self-sustaining entity for their own family because the owners and the big bosses are always going to take money away from them.
Right, exactly.
It also involved a learning for this family, especially Juan, who's one of the perspectives that we get through this read. And that learning involves how she has to fit into this new country.
Mm-hmm. And fitting into the country is difficult because not only does Xuan struggle with English, but she also struggles to find connections with other people. Where they're at, there isn't an established Vietnamese community, so finding that piece of home comes from them and only her family.
Right.
And one quote that I want to point out from on pages 55 to 56 is that as hard as we tried, it seemed like there would always be a gulf between where we came from and where we were.
Yeah, and that gulf does seem to loom larger because of trying to figure out how to fit in with people. One of the things that we see is said to Xuan by her father explains about how he doesn't trust people that talk too much, but much more people that take action.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in America, that's much more of what we see are people that do a lot of talking rather than the actual completing of tasks. And on top of that, a quote that she says that explains her situation is, when I did not speak here in this new land, everyone seemed to forget I was even here. So she's in this place where she doesn't know how to speak the language, she doesn't know how to fit in, she doesn't know how to trust people.
Mm-hmm.
All she does learn is that through her nail salon job, one of her coworkers teaches her how to say, "How are you?" and "You look very nice today" in English. And that's the way that she ends up getting by for a long time, by just asking people how they are and then complimenting them. And
Mm-hmm.
that seemed to have been enough for her to just feel like she actually fit in a sense.
Right. Fit in a way that makes her life a little more livable in
Right.
this country.
Right. We also see a perspective of Juan and her distrust in US medicine and Western
Mhm.
culture, which then describes what is going on with her daughter An.
Yes. We're introduced to An in the middle of a manic episode, and this is her at 17 years old. Unfortunately, because of the manic episode, she is kept in a psychiatric hospital where both her and her parents don't understand what's happening.
Right. And she's constantly being told that she needs to be kept there for her safety. Her parent, especially through Juan's perspective, has no idea how to deal with this. She doesn't know what a manic episode is because that's not something that I guess was even prevalent at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And this physician who's there is trying to prescribe drugs so that An can get some help for the things that she's dealing with.
Right. And on top of that, this is the first time this has ever happened to An.
Right. And one of the things that I really appreciate, and this might be because the author, Dr. Nguyen, is a psychiatrist herself,
Mm-hmm.
she does such a great job of putting us into perspective of what An is going through. This book is written through first person perspectives. In each chapter, we're either going to bounce between Xuan or An through different timelines. But when we do get to An, we see the perspective of how her body is so out of control.
Mm-hmm.
She feels like this person who is being bombarded and not necessarily attacked, but in a sense, just being overrun and not having control of the things that she can do, say, or even act at that time.
Right. But she also has this awareness about her, which Dr. Nguyen adds into the mix. Like, not only is she feeling this manic episode and seeing it happen, but she's also realizing at the same time that this is not a way that I would act in real life.
Right. And this kind of brought me to my thinking of the journey that I've been on with trying to figure out my own person and finding out through different diagnoses that I have ADHD. And
Mm-hmm.
there are probably other layers to that that I'm still trying to figure out and deal with. There are parts of me that sometimes when I say things, I don't feel like I have control of it and it just comes out and I don't know where it really comes from. And there's a lot of parts that just feels like what An's going through where I'm sitting inside my body and other things are happening. And in a sense, I don't always feel like I have the most control over the things that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
One of those descriptions is even when we've talked about like my Han and like my anger.
Yes.
It's like once I started gaining the awareness of what was happening, I now can physically see that happening and it doesn't feel like I can stop it, which is
Mm.
kind of how I've described it in the past. It feels like something is flying and rushing out of me before I can actually grab it and stop it. And the perspective that we get from On and the way that this is written is so helpful for people that may not understand what that feels like. And honestly, for a lot of people that might judge how other people are handling their neurodivergence or the things that they're struggling with.
For sure.
I really appreciated this part. I feel like this is not only a massive part of the character of An, but maybe what the storytelling was supposed to be around.
Mm-hmm.
We are seeing On grow as a human. We're seeing her having to transition to another school because her parents think it's better for her. We are also seeing her become a person who is stuck between two cultures. One who is an American because that's where she's born and that's all she knows, and one who's Vietnamese because that's what she's raised in. That's everything around her and the environment that surrounds her.
That surrounds her at home,
Right.
for sure. And when we're introduced to On in these growing years, we see that she introduces herself using an Americanized version of her name. And we also see a moment where she asks her mom if she can use her mom's wedding aodai to use as a costume for Halloween.
Right. It's that separation of culture, and what we see from On's perspective is that it seems so normal.
Mm,
And for me, at least, growing up in a place that did have Asian culture around me, but everyone was of a different background, so it was a diversity of different Americans that grew up here. I see On's perspective and I see where she's coming from. Like the time I wanted to go to Outback Steakhouse was just because I wanted to have an American birthday.
mm,
What we then see from Juan's perspective is different, and I think that's more of probably how my parents felt.
mm.
So on page 78, a direct quote of what Juan sees is, Long and I both feel the gradual erosion of our ties to our motherland. Our children are growing up more American than Vietnamese. The loss is slow and not easily noticed on a daily basis, but the sand slips away underneath our feet each time the ocean climbs up on shore, drawing back an inch or two of shoreline each year. Without seawalls to protect it, one's own culture slowly slips away like grains of sand in an hourglass until one day nothing is left except the empty place where something once existed.
Mm-hmm.
I've never thought about that from my parents' perspective. It's traumatizing. It must be so hard for them to view that aspect of your children no longer growing up in what you know.
Right, exactly. That reminds me of my parents and how they struggled whether or not to teach their children, us, their language. And unfortunately, the Americanization won, which is why we pretty much only speak English fluently.
Right, right, right. As much to the opposition of your nanai, y'all do speak English, and no one has decided to take up more Tagalog.
Well, the thing is, after looking more into our heritage, Tagalog isn't even our language. It's Pangasinan and Ilocano, and both of those languages my parents understand and speak, but even those languages we don't know either.
Right. And I wonder if it's because your parents first were separated from their languages to then speak Tagalog and speak
Mm.
English that they understand maybe your journey a little bit more.
It's possible, yeah.
Like for my parents, all they've known is Korean, and my dad did have to learn Chinese in school because of the takeover that happened in Korea. So he had to speak another language, but he didn't have to really accept a different culture.
Hmm.
So I'm curious if that's maybe the differences between our backgrounds and what our parents are expecting of us a bit.
For sure. Personally, I'm hoping to continuously learn more about my culture, whether it be the language or the food or the tattoos. I want to fully encompass that more in my daily life.
Yeah, and I am continuing to try to seek out more and more history about Korea, about what happened during different occupations, and trying to figure out who that is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a book like this only makes me crave that a little bit more.
Mm.
I love how Dr. Nguyen is creating these two perspectives, both of equal difficulty, both of equal traumas that they're trying to figure out, but that classic mother-daughter relationship that causes a clash and causes two people to butt heads that are actually trying to go in the same direction sometimes.
Absolutely. And for An in particular, she's a third culture kid. Not only is her parents trying to bring in Vietnamese culture, and not only is she trying to fit in into the US culture, she's also figuring out what it means to be a local.
Right. Yeah, filling in that role as a Hawaiian in this world that is being terrorized by American presence as well.
Mm-hmm. So many layers.
Yeah, I have really enjoyed the first read. It goes by so quickly. The different perspectives kind of drive the narration of the story, and it feels so fluid within the whole storytelling. There is a little bit of jumping back and forth between timelines, which I usually don't like, but in this book, it seems seamless. Like there was a reason to be in certain times, and it made sense for why we were there and why we were in someone else's shoes, whether it was Juan or Ans.
Definitely. It was though the struggles allowed us to link between the jumping points.
Right, right. So we have two more reads of this book. It is going by a lot faster than I thought it would, but hopefully we get to savor the journey as we go on it. And that next journey is going to involve,
Pages 81 through 151, and those are chapters 15 on 1992 through chapter 32 on 1993.
yeah. So we'll move 1 year ahead. But for anyone that has any questions about maybe where to find this book, what they might feel about it, because honestly, for me, as an Asian American kid and first generation, I find so much similarities between who An is and who I am. So I would definitely email into the show. And how can people do that?
Y'all can email us at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com, or you can find us on Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
Yep, and we also have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com. That has our bookshop where we have books that we've read in the past, books that we recommend, and books that we plan to read in the future.
And a great way to support us is to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast.
Otherwise, make sure to be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat.
Bye.
Bye.